We don't have time for slow walkers blocking the aisle. The flight attendant snaps at the elderly man struggling with his carry-on. 83-year-old Robert Chun feels every passenger's impatient stare burning into his back as he fumbles. With his worn duffel bag, the weight of his Purple Heart pressing against his chest beneath his faded jacket, invisible to everyone around him, what happens next will leave you speechless. If stories like this remind you why we should never judge by appearances, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments about a time someone surprised you with their hidden strength. Robert Chun had been awake since 4 in the morning. At 83, sleep came in short pieces, and today his old wounds were acting up again. The shrapnel in his left leg always knew when rain was coming, and the storm clouds gathering outside his hotel window had been sending sharp reminders. All night, he was flying home to Portland after visiting his grandson's graduation in Chicago. 3 days of ceremonies, family dinners, and long conversations about the future. His grandson was headed to medical school. Robert had slipped him an envelope with enough money to cover his first year, money he had been saving for decades. Now, he stood in the jet bridge, passengers pushing past him as he tried to get his old green duffel bag properly positioned on his shoulder. The bag wasn't heavy, but his hands weren't as steady as they used to be. 60 years ago, those same hands had carried wounded soldiers through rice paddies in Vietnam. Today, they shook slightly as he adjusted the worn strap. The flight attendant, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and sharp makeup, watched him with obvious irritation. Her name tag read Sarah, and she was clearly having a bad day. She had already snapped at 2 other passengers about overhead bin space and seat assignments. Sir, you need to move faster, she said loudly enough for half the plane to hear. Other passengers are trying to board. Robert nodded and tried to quicken his pace, but his left leg wasn't cooperating. The metal fragment lodged near his knee had been there since 1968, a souvenir from a mortar attack that had killed 3 of his closest friends. He had learned to live with the pain and the slight limp, but on days like today, when the weather was changing, every step was a reminder. As he made his way down the narrow aisle, his duffel bag caught on an armrest. He stopped to free it, causing a small backup of passengers behind him. The businessman directly behind him let out an annoyed sigh. Come on, old man, the businessman muttered. Some of us have connecting flights. Robert freed his bag and continued forward, his face burning with embarrassment. He found his seat, 14B, a middle seat in economy. He had purchased the ticket months ago, choosing the cheapest option because old habits died hard. Growing up during the Depression had taught him never to spend money unnecessarily, even though he could afford better now. As he tried to stow his duffel bag in the overhead compartment, his arthritis made it difficult to lift his arms high enough. The bag bumped against the compartment door and fell back down, nearly hitting the passenger in the aisle seat. Watch it. The passenger snapped, a young man in an expensive suit who was busy typing on his phone. Robert tried again, this time managing to get the bag halfway into the compartment before his strength gave out. The bag slipped again, this time actually grazing the young man's shoulder. Sarah, the flight attendant, appeared beside him, her patience clearly exhausted. Sir, if you can't handle your luggage properly, we're going to have to check it at the gate, she said in a voice that carried throughout the cabin. This is holding up the entire boarding process. I'm sorry, Robert said quietly. Just need a moment to get it positioned right. A moment? Sarah's voice rose higher. Sir, you've been struggling with that bag for 5 minutes. Other passengers are still trying to board, and we have a schedule to keep. Robert felt every eye in the surrounding rows watching him. A teenage girl in the seat behind was recording on her phone. An older woman 2 rows up was shaking her head in disapproval, though whether at him or the flight attendant, he couldn't tell. Look, Sarah continued, crossing her arms, maybe flying isn't the best option for someone who can't keep up with basic requirements. There are other ways to travel that might be more suitable for your limitations. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. His limitations. If only she knew what he had overcome in his life. If only she knew about the 19 months he had spent in a North Vietnamese prison camp, or the 3 bronze stars collecting dust in his closet at home, or the men he had saved by carrying them on his back through miles of jungle. But he said nothing. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when you were outnumbered and surrounded by strangers who had already made up their minds about you. A man in his 40s, sitting across the aisle, finally stood up. To help. "Let me get that for you," he said kindly, lifting Robert's bag into the compartment with ease. "Thank you," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah wasn't finished. "And sir," she added, "next time you fly, you might want to consider paying for the baggage handling service. It would save everyone a lot of trouble." Robert sank into his middle seat, wedged between the businessman who was still typing angrily on his phone and an elderly woman who offered him a sympathetic smile. He could hear passengers behind him whispering about the delay, about how airlines should have age restrictions, about how some people shouldn't be allowed to travel alone. The businessman beside him made no effort to lower his voice as he spoke into his phone. "Yeah, I'm going to be late." Some old guy held up boarding for 10 minutes because he couldn't lift his bag. Airlines really need to screen these people better. Robert stared straight ahead, his hands folded in his lap. Beneath his worn jacket, he could feel the small velvet box in his inside pocket. It contained the Purple Heart he had received after the mortar attack that nearly killed him. He always carried it when he traveled, not out of pride, but as a reminder of the men who hadn't made it home. Sarah made another announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the boarding delay. We ask that all passengers come prepared for travel and be mindful of our schedules and fellow passengers." The message was clear, and Robert felt the weight of every stare. He had become the problem passenger, the inconvenience that everyone would remember when they told stories about their flight delays. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah walked down the aisle, checking seat belts and overhead compartments. When she reached Robert's row, she stopped and looked down at him with barely concealed annoyance. "Sir, I hope you understand that your behavior today was unacceptable. Flying is a privilege, not a right, and if you can't handle the basic requirements, you should consider other transportation options." Robert looked up at her, this young woman who couldn't have been much older than his granddaughter. He saw someone who had never been tested, never faced real hardship, never learned that true strength sometimes looked like weakness to those who had never needed to find it within themselves. "I understand," he said simply. "Good," Sarah replied. "I'd hate to have to file a report about an uncooperative passenger." She moved on, leaving Robert to sit with his humiliation as the plane taxied toward the runway. Around him, passengers settled in for the 3-hour flight to Portland. The businessman beside him was still on his phone, now complaining about airline policies and incompetent crew members. Robert closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to a different time, when he was 19 years old and bulletproof. Before he learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He thought about his friends who never made it home, about promises made in foxholes and jungle clearings, about the weight of survival and the burden of memory. Plane lifted off, carrying Robert toward home and away from the most humiliating experience he had endured in years. He had faced enemy fire, survived capture and torture, rebuilt his life from nothing, and raised a family with love and dignity. But none of that mattered to the people around him now. To them, he was just an old man who couldn't keep up, a burden on their schedule, an inconvenience to be tolerated. What Robert didn't know was that Captain Michael Torres, the pilot of Flight 447, had been watching the entire scene unfold through the open cockpit door. And Captain Torres recognized something in the old man's bearing that others had missed. Something that would soon change everything. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Captain Torres made a decision that would transform the story of humiliation into something far more powerful. He unbuckled his harness and walked into the cabin, heading straight for seat 14B, where an 83-year-old hero sat in silence, carrying the weight of his service and the sting of public shame. The reckoning was about to begin.